most powerful combat aircraft ever built have been the strategic bombers. This video ordnance program takes a look at the United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command and the backbone of its bomber force, the legendary B-52. Strategic air power differs from tactical air power in its basic mission. Tactical air power is designed for close-range attack against the conventional forces of an opponent, the enemy's army, navy, and air force. Strategic air power takes the war deep into the enemy's heartland, against industrial targets, national command centers, and strategic weapons bases. The advent of the atomic bomb in 1945 made strategic air power potentially the most destructive force in human history. During the Cold War, the primary target of the U.S. Air Force's Strategic Air Command was the Soviet Union. Its primary mission was to deter the Soviet Union from attacking the United States by threatening to retaliate with nuclear weapons. From the end of World War II until the early 1960s, the strategic bomber was the only reliable weapon system which could carry out this mission. By 1960, two new weapons were added to the strategic forces: the intercontinental ballistic missile and the submarine-launched ballistic missile. These three weapons composed the nuclear triad, intended to deter the threat of thermonuclear war. At the heart of the Cold War was an unsettling paradox: the preparation of weapons capable of unimaginable destruction, the main purpose of which was to prevent such an unthinkable war from occurring. Today's strategic bombers evolved from the propeller-driven bombers of World War II, such as the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress. After World War II, more advanced propeller-driven bombers entered service, including the enormous B-36. Propeller-driven aircraft were more efficient than the early jets for long-range missions. Early jet bombers, such as the B-47, could not reach targets in the Soviet Union from bases in the United States. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress of 1955 was the first jet bomber with intercontinental range. It could be based at airfields in the northern United States and reach targets over 3,000 miles away in the Soviet Union. The tactics of strategic bombers evolved during the Cold War. As in World War II, the enemy interceptor was the main opponent of the bomber in the 1950s. New rocket weapons made the interceptors more deadly than their World War II ancestors. In the 1960s, the Air Force considered replacing the B-52 with the supersonic B-70 bomber, much faster than the B-52, so better able to evade enemy fighters. But with the development of anti-aircraft missiles in the early 1960s, the threat changed. Missiles, not enemy fighters, became the main threat. The Air Force stuck with the B-52 and switched tactics instead of aircraft. The B-52 could no longer attack from high altitude, since it would be too vulnerable to the new missiles. It would now have to attack at low altitude, using terrain to mask its approach from enemy radars. New weapons were added to the B-52's arsenal for the new tactics. Quail decoy missiles could be launched away from the attacking B-52, creating false radar images. The quails would fool enemy radar operators since they could not distinguish the real bomber from the decoys. Short-range SRAM missiles could be used to attack the enemy radars and missile sites, blasting a hole through the enemy defenses before the bombers approached the main target. The Vietnam War distracted Strategic Air Command from its nuclear mission and gave the B-52s a new role. There was the need for an aircraft capable of carrying much larger bomb loads than the small fighter bombers already in action over Vietnam. Like their World War II ancestors, a portion of the B-52 fleet was modified to carry conventional high-explosive bombs instead of nuclear bombs. The B-52s could carry 19 tons of bombs in their cavernous bomb bays and on new pylons fastened to their wings. The B-52 missions were codenamed Arclight and began in 1965. Instead of their traditional strategic mission, the B-52s were committed to the tactical air war, bombing Viet Cong positions, supply routes, and staging areas. By 1968, when the air war was temporarily suspended, the B-52s had dropped over 885,000 tons of bombs. B-52s were eventually committed to a strategic bombing campaign against industrial and military targets in North Vietnam in 1972. Codenamed Linebacker 2, B-52 raids were credited by many as forcing the North Vietnamese to the peace deal. After nearly a decade of conventional bombing missions, the B-52 force switched its attention back to its traditional role of nuclear deterrence. By the time the Vietnam War ended, there were serious questions whether the B-52s were still adequate in the strategic bomber role. A new strategic bomber, the B-1, was being developed as a possible replacement. It could fly at supersonic speeds, at low level to better penetrate Soviet defenses. But another new innovation saved the B-52 from retirement again. While trying to develop a replacement for the Quail decoy missile, it became apparent that with new technology, the missile could carry a nuclear warhead to a target as accurately as the B-52. Instead of the B-52 having to run the gauntlet of Soviet air defenses, it could fire a missile from outside the defenses. This small missile was called the Air-Launched Cruise Missile, or ALCM. It would be much less vulnerable to being shot down by anti-aircraft missiles than the B-52 bomber itself. The B-1 was put on hold, but only temporarily. In the 1980s, a modernized version of the B-1 bomber, called the B-1B, was added to the Air Force inventory, nearly 20 years since the last B-52 had been delivered. The B-1B incorporates some features to reduce its visibility to enemy radar, though not enough to call it a stealth aircraft. In the late 1980s, the first of the true stealth bombers, the B-2, took to the air for the first time. The radar-resistant B-1B and B-2 performed the penetrator role, flying all the way to the target to deliver their weapons. The more visible and more vulnerable B-52 is used in the standoff role, firing its missiles from hundreds of miles away from the target. Stealth cannot be added to the B-52 itself, but it can be added to its payload. The B-52 is now equipped with a stealth cruise missile, the ACM, seen here. Innovations like the ACM, as well as frequent improvements to the B-52 itself, have extended the life of the B-52 squadrons well into the next century. The B-52 remains the most numerous bomber in the Air Force today, over 30 years after the last B-52 left the factory. Many of the bombers flying today are older than the pilots who fly them, the ground crews who keep them operating. Before 16th Wing at Griffiths Air Force Base in Rome, New York, is typical of the units which fly the B-52.
The B-52G has been here since January 1960, and in fact the 416th Wing has a record of B-52G operations, and we've kind of concluded our chapter with the Persian Gulf War. The B-52G, as it flew in the war, is a lot different than when the airplane first came in 31 years ago. Interior is totally updated, modern avionics, offensive avionics system, strategic radar, vastly improved electronic countermeasures to make it a very effective fighting platform.
The B-52 has been kept going by a continual program of rebuilding and improvement. Over the years, so many parts have been changed on each aircraft that little remains of the original machine.
B-52's been modified so many times. I don't even know if there's an original piece on the aircraft except for maybe the skin and the engines. The engines have been around for the longest time. The bomb nav system's been modified several times. Probably the only original stuff left on the aircraft is the airframes. I don't even know if you could say the airframes itself because they've been through depot level maintenance so many times. The skin's been replaced, the engines have been replaced. It's really, every time it goes in a depot, you're coming out with a new airplane. So, you could fly the plane probably forever, but obviously eventually become obsolete.
Two versions of the B-52 are currently in Air Force service, B-52G and the B-52H. After all the rebuilding of both types over the years, they are nearly identical in appearance. The B-52H has a number of improvements.
Well, the H model is, of course, a series improvement on the B-52 fleet, and it's the last of the breed, if you will, the Cadillac of the force. Essentially, the largest significant difference is in the engine, which is a fan jet engine. An earlier technology, low bypass fan, but it offers improved fuel consumption, greater range. Of course, there's some improvements in the electronic countermeasures of the aircraft. Some of the weapon suites, certainly the fire control system is different. If you will, it is the ultimate evolution of the series of the B-52 airplane.
The crew of the B-52 numbers 6. The pilot and co-pilot in the forward cockpit, electronic warfare officer and gunner behind them, and the navigator and offensive systems officer below them in the lower compartment. The cockpit of the B-52 is reminiscent of the older bombers or jet airliners, with massive throttle control for the aircraft's 8 engines. Over the years, the instrument panel has changed as the aircraft electronics have improved. The biggest changes have come in the aircraft electronics operated by the crew in the rear compartments.
My primary job is working with the radar set of the B-52. I'm also the bombardier. I'm the one who handles the weapons to make sure that they get to the proper location at the proper time. The radar navigator is responsible for operating the radar scope downstairs. He's also responsible for using 2 television cameras we have downstairs to aid us in bombing. And of course, it is a radar's major job is to get the plane to the bomb site and to drop the proper ordnance on the target.
Unlike World War II bombers, which relied on their machine guns to defend themselves, the B-52 primarily uses its electronic systems for protection.
I'm part of the defensive team. Myself and the gunner work together to defend the aircraft against various threats, and that can be threats such as surface-to-air missiles or anti-aircraft artillery, or in conjunction with the gunner especially with other airborne interceptors. And to defeat those threats or to defend against them, we use various electronic equipment along with expendables such as chaff and flare systems.
The B-52 is the last American bomber fitted with a defensive gun system. The gun system is a last-ditch defense against enemy fighters. During the Vietnam War, the rear guns had shot down enemy fighters on 2 occasions.
There's 2 models of B-52. The B-52G model carries the ASG-15 fire control system. It has 4 50 caliber machine guns. And the B-52H carries the ASG-21 fire control system, which is a 20 millimeter Gatling gun. And basically, it's all radar controlled from the front. I sit with the crew in the cockpit, as opposed to the D models where the gunner sat in the tail. And I control everything from radar. It's all a wire-controlled, computer-controlled system.
The B-52 has never been used in its original role of delivering nuclear weapons. The Vietnam experience highlighted its usefulness in conflicts short of nuclear war. As a result, the U.S. Air Force has maintained a small force of B-52G bombers configured for the conventional bombing role. With the winding down of the Cold War, the B-52's dual capability, conventional or nuclear, gives it a unique versatility compared to other weapons in the strategic triad. This double capability is called the twin triad.
Okay, as you know, the concept of the manned bomber is really because it gives us a lot of flexibility and capability to operate in all spectrums of conflict. And although our primary mission here is nuclear, as we saw in Desert Storm, the B-52 can adapt very quickly to the conventional arena. And really with the new concept of twin triad, that's where our training will continue to focus, is the capability to really do both missions. And that's enables us to do whatever the national command authorities need done, as long as it's within the capabilities of the airplane, which, as we saw in Desert Storm, has a lot of versatility.
The conventional attack mission requires different training and different tactics from the nuclear strike mission.
I think probably one of the more significant differences is the number and variety of weapons that the airplane can carry in a conventional scenario. Typically, in the standard role of the B-52, we're talking about a one-pass, pinpoint, usually one weapon release, as opposed to in a conventional, multi-ships going against a target, perhaps from several different axes of attack, and dropping up to the airplane's capacity of 51 weapons, and trying to compress or extend the train of those weapons so as to get total coverage and destruction of the target area. That in itself is a more difficult coordination process for the air crew and for the other air crews and the other aircraft that may be involved in that particular scenario.
The B-52 has an important role in conventional missions for two reasons: its heavy payload and its long range. The B-52 has a range of over 5,000 miles, but it can fly non-stop around the globe by means of aerial refueling. The importance of aerial refueling for B-52 missions has led to the creation of a large fleet of dedicated tanker aircraft. The KC-135 is a tanker version of the famous Boeing 707 jetliner. Like the B-52, the KC-135 has been in service for over 30 years. It has undergone continual modification to extend its lifespan and to improve its performance. The new KC-135R can offload 50% more fuel than its earlier versions.
With the KC-135R model, we have improved the capabilities of the KC-135 aircraft by basically giving them bigger engines, more thrust available. It allows us to take off with more fuel than the old A model, and also allows us, we burn less fuel, so we're more efficient. We can fly farther and offload more gas.
The B-52 has a special refueling receptacle on the fuselage above the cockpit. The pilot of the B-52 carefully flies his aircraft to a predetermined location behind and below the KC-135. Then the boom operator in the tanker aircraft carefully lowers the refueling boom to mate up the two aircraft. The boom operator is one of the crewmen unique to the KC-135. His responsibility is to control the refueling boom which connects the B-52 with the KC-135 tanker. When refueling the B-52, nearly 1,000 gallons flow down the refueling boom every minute, a ton of fuel every 20 seconds.
The challenges I face is, if we have any turbulence, weather conditions that prohibit a smooth contact, I always want to get a real smooth contact with the receiver so you don't basically scratch your name in his paint or hit him in any way, windshield. You got to fly the boom around, make sure it's controlled real smoothly. You don't want to overextend to get to a receiver. You want to keep him pretty close to you, but not too close. We have 4 pumps we can turn on to use to refuel the aircraft, and it basically depends on the size of the aircraft. If it's a heavy, we can use all 4 pumps, a heavy being like a B-52, C-5, whereas a fighter, sometimes we can only use 1 or 2 of the pumps to refuel them. It takes usually 5 to 10 minutes to give them their gas.
The importance of tankers to B-52 bomber missions has been recognized by organizational changes in the Air Force in recent years. In the past, squadrons and wings were organized around a specific type of aircraft. For example, a wing of B-52 bombers or a wing of KC-135 tankers. Now, wings like the 416th at Griffiths are composite organizations flying squadrons of both tankers and bombers. The new organization permits the bombers and tankers to better coordinate their training, like this refueling exercise. With the bombers' fuel tanks replenished, the tankers head back to base.
Okay, new airspeed is 157. Going to ground idle, 7,120.
For B-52 units like the 416th, the training for conventional missions would be put to the test in 1991 with the outbreak of the war with Iraq. As the United States Air Force began to plan air strikes against Iraq in the winter of 1990, thoughts turned to the B-52. The B-52 had unique capabilities for many of the missions being planned for Operation Desert Storm. The B-52's first mission would prove to be the most arduous and the most secret. B-52s took off from Barksdale, Louisiana, and flew non-stop to Iraq. Their mission was to strike at targets in northern Iraq with Alchem cruise missiles. The Alchem strikes would destroy key Iraqi facilities and pave the way for subsequent strikes by short-range fighter bombers. The Barksdale B-52s were in the air for 34 hours, the longest combat mission in history. Following these first cruise missile strikes, conventional bomb attacks were launched by other B-52 units based in Europe and the Indian Ocean. Even though the Air Force placed great importance in precision-guided bombs, for some targets, the heavy payload of the B-52s was a necessity. An industrial facility like this plant at Al-Qaim needed many bombs to be put out of operation. The B-52s were based out of Fairford, England, Morone, Spain, and Diego Garcia Island in the Indian Ocean. The missions were long and arduous.
Some of the things that were a little different during the Gulf War were, of course, the mission planning and the times of the flights that we had done over there. Usually about 17-hour flights. Total time was anywhere between 24 and 26 hours for our duty day. We'd arrive usually 5 to 6 hours prior to takeoff, go through some real serious type of mission planning, which also included a lot of target study, threats, and also they gave us some private time to be with a little bit of a religion type, which I thought was really kind of interesting. Then we go ahead and take off, 17-hour missions in country and back. Those are very long and exhausting. By the time you landed and then gave your debriefs, it was maybe 26 hours, 27 hours in time. Very long time.
The B-52s typically flew in groups of 3 aircraft called a cell as a defensive tactic. The early missions were flown at night and at low altitude. Once the Iraqi Air Force had been eliminated, the tactics changed and high-altitude missions were possible.
Well, most of the missions in the Gulf started off from locations that required an extremely long flight to the target area. 16, 17, 18 hours was not uncommon. Effectively, the aircraft would go in a multi-ship cell, 3 or more airplanes, at first low altitude against pinpoint and defended Iraqi targets, and later as the air threat subsided, when we achieved air supremacy and air superiority, the aircraft transitioned to a high altitude structure where they would go in and do such things as close air support, battlefield air interdiction, interdiction of the Republican Guard in the rear areas, and in fact were involved in some of the breaching operations before the ground war began to support all the ground forces.
B-52s seldom operated without the assistance of tanker aircraft, especially those flying from distant bases in Europe or the Indian Ocean. Besides taking care of the B-52s, the KC-135 tankers spent a great deal of their time refueling the smaller tactical fighter bombers going north to strike Iraq.
Most all the missions that we flew in support of Desert Storm were fighter support missions where we would refuel fighters going in on strike missions. We would refuel them prior to their strike and then after they came out so they could get back home.
During Desert Storm, B-52s dropped over 30% of the bombs delivered. The Desert Storm experience was followed shortly afterwards by the tumultuous changes in the Soviet Union. As the antagonisms of the Cold War end, the missions of the B-52s have begun to change. Until 1991, a portion of the B-52 force was kept on constant alert in the event of war with the Soviet Union. In 1991, those alerts were finally halted, and the B-52s were given a more relaxed posture. Training in B-52 units is shifting towards more conventional missions, like those in Desert Storm.
Historically, our primary mission has been nuclear deterrence, and that's where a lot of our training has been tied down, is to have the capability to perform that mission if necessary. However, as you saw in Desert Storm, and with the changing world conditions, the B-52 as part of the twin triad concept is moving more towards the conventional arena, where we can be used to diffuse world tensions as needed at any level of conventional conflict.
As a sign of changing times, in 1991 the Strategic Air Command was absorbed into the United States Air Force's new Air Combat Command. Remarkably, it has been the venerable B-52 that has best survived the changes in strategic bombing over the past 4 decades. With its distinguished combat record from Vietnam to Desert Storm, the B-52 bomber has come to symbolize strategic air power.